views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of Bronxnet or the program underwriters.
Hello, I am Jose Higuera, Deputy Director of the Mexican Studies Institute at CUNY. Welcome to one more edition of the Mexican Studies Oral History Project. Today, I have the pleasure to welcome our guest, Juan Carlos Aguirre, Executive Director of Mano Mano, Mexican Culture Without Borders. Juan Carlos, welcome and thank you for being here.
Thank you for inviting me.
Juan Carlos, can we start by just having a short history of how did Mano Mano started?
Yes, so Mano Mano started in 2001 as a project at the Center for Traditional Music and Dance. And it was a committee that brought together Mexicans, Mexican Americans, and Americans to talk about the future of the Mexican community. Back then, it was in the city, it was growing. And so they wanted to do projects regarding the community. And so that's how it all started.
And who founded it? Do you have
So
that?
there's a lot of people.
Uh-huh.
A lot of the people that were involved, have the title as founder.
Mm-hmm.
But the person who made the organization as an actual nonprofit was Emily Sokolov, who was the previous director of Mano Mano.
Okay, and do you focus on, well, I know you focus on different traditions, but do you have any specific ones that you focus on during the year?
When the organization started, the idea was to celebrate anything Mexico, right? So
Mm-hmm.
that was culture, language, the arts. But as the organization, started to, with time, we decided to focus on traditional Mexican culture. And so we do public events, which is one of the major things we do. And the other one was to do a lot of workshops and classes with students in grammar school, high school, college.
And do you have specific ones, like, I know you celebrate Dia de Muertos. Do you have any other that's...
Yeah, so the calendar of events varies from year to year, but normally there's about 3 or 4 that are annual events. So the annual events are Day of the Dead and Posadas, which is a Christmas holiday celebration in December.
Do you have also something for children? Or?
So from time to time we do Children's Day, which happens sometime in April.
Uh-huh.
This year we are celebrating it, but it doesn't happen annually.
And how about Independence Day or Cinco de Mayo?
Independence Day happens. It's not annual, but it does happen. And Cinco de Mayo is a very, very busy time for us. So we don't have time to put up a public event, but we do a lot of activities with schools and universities.
Okay, and I remember this past November you had a very big event. Can you tell us a little bit about this, Dia de Muertos, and where was it and how did
Sure.
it came to be?
Sure, we had 2 events. So first was our annual festival of Day of the Dead, which happens at St. Mark's Church in the Bowery. And that was a great event. It's been happening for the past 15 years. And then the following week we had the museum, the Natural History Museum, hire our organization to work with them to celebrate Day of the Dead. And that was a very big event. According to their information, we had approximately 10,000 people show up on that day.
Well, I attended the event, and I think you probably had more, like around 15,000, I would bet.
Yeah, there was a lot of people.
There were a lot of people. And I know that you also try to promote different emergent artists. Do you focus only on emergent artists from New York City, or do you also promote Mexican artists from Mexico? How does that work?
When the organization started, the focus was to promote people who lived in New York. So if there were artists who were living in New York or transitioning through New York, it was in our interest to work with them and to hire them. We don't hire so much artists from Mexico or that come to the U.S. just to perform. There's a lot of venues that do that already, so we wanted to focus on the ones that are here locally.
Okay, and do your events, do they have a fee or they're open to the public?
I would say 99.9% of the events are free. Occasionally we may do a small fee, but most of them are free.
And I remember this year last year, this past December, you had the Posadas and you had to change the venues. Why was this?
Because of the number of people. So and I believe that has to do with what happened with Day of the Dead. So we published the event, and within a few days, the numbers just started to grow. We do a lot of RSVPs because we want to know approximately how many people would show up. And that was an event that was planned for 400 people, and we ended up having about over 1,000 people.
Yes. And before this new venue that you decided to have in Sunset Park, right?
Sunset Park.
Where were you before that? For the Posadas?
Posadas event, that event, we move it depending on a lot of factors, but it moves from neighborhood to neighborhood. So we had it in Washington Heights, we had it in Harlem, in East Harlem, Sunset Park. So it moves around, and it all depends on the community members. Sometimes people from Brooklyn say, oh, come here and have the event with us. And that's basically what happens. Sometime in the summer, a lot of people ask us to go to their neighborhood to have events.
And so do you try to do the programming depending on where the Mexican community is, or what is your target audience for that?
So initially, what we wanted to do, and the majority of our events happen in Manhattan. And the reason for that is because the Mexican community is spread all across New York City and also in New Jersey. So what we wanted to do is be in a central location where anybody could come from any borough. When we take events out of Manhattan, the population changes. So the event that we had in Brooklyn, it was mostly people from Brooklyn. If we have it in Manhattan, we have people from all over New York City. So we try to stay in Manhattan because of that, but it's also important to go out into the different boroughs and have events.
And which one do you think it's the most popular? I know that Day of the Dead is one of them, right? But aside from Day of the Dead, what other events that you have or workshops are popular with the community?
So obviously Day of the Dead is a big explosion. It has become a very, very important event. And we're very cautious about that event because we curate the event so that it stays true to its tradition. But aside from that, things that are very popular are whatever is making, craft making, art making. We do a lot of handcrafts that are traditional handcrafts that are made in Mexico. That people have been making for hundreds of years. A lot of those we make them here in schools and in community centers, and those are very, very popular.
And there's also a component of education, correct? So can you tell us a little bit about we've been talking about Day of the Dead, Dia de Muertos. Can you just share with us shortly, what is Day of the Dead?
Well, Day of the Dead is a time we take to honor and revere those who have died, especially our family members. And we do that by building them offerings, which are the ofrendas or altars that are called here. And the idea is, so Mexico is a very large country and it's a very diverse country. And depending on what part of Mexico people come from, the tradition varies or changes a little bit. And here in New York, we are trying to do something similar. When we started the event, the reason we started it was because people were not celebrating Day of the Dead in New York. And so we thought, why not? But then we realized that it's difficult to celebrate Day of the Dead because it involves candles, burning incense, and preparing specific foods and things like that. So what we decided to do was to create a public, or to have a public setting where people could come and celebrate with us if they couldn't celebrate at home. And that's how the event became so big. When we started the event, there were, I don't know, like 100 people who attended. Nowadays, there's about 8,000 people that stop by.
8,000. And is it only one day, or do you celebrate
It's 3 to 5 days, depending on weather and many other things.
Oh, great. So, and this is, again, open to the public?
It's open to the public.
Oh, that's great. Juan Carlos, thank you. This is super interesting. So we are going to go to a short break, and when we return, we'll talk more about Mano Mano, Mexican culture without borders. Stay with us.
We are together. And for the last 20 years, we have been building on a vision to share our views, our voices on our channels. We are the Bronx. We are Bronxnet.
Welcome back to the Mexican Studies Oral History Project. If you're just joining us, today we're talking with Juan Carlos Aguirre, Executive Director of Mano Mano, Mexican Culture Without Borders. Juan Carlos, thank you again for being here with us. So, in addition to the many traditional festivities that Mano Mano celebrates, what other things do you do regarding education? Do you do workshops? What do you do?
So most of I would say everything that we do has an educational component. The workshops that we do in schools especially, normally they take about an hour, 2 hours. And when we start, we always take 10 to 15 minutes to talk about the history of the tradition we are presenting. So if we are doing, let me give you the simplest thing. If we're doing paper flowers, right? Paper flowers is a tradition that started in Puebla over 200 years ago. And so we talk to, we tell students the history of how that started, where it started, and how paper came to Mexico, right? Who invented paper? Was there paper in Mexico before the Europeans came? The answer is yes. Many are surprised. So we talk about the traditions because we want people to understand the history and then to fall in love with the history and make, you know, the crafts that we're trying to pass on. And the idea is that everything that we do is passed on to them, and they can pass it on to their children or to whoever they like.
And so do you focus on adults to share this tradition so they can actually share it with their children, or is it more that workshops are there more catered towards educational institutions like schools for children?
So we have them by ages or like, you know, age brackets. So we do, you know, 5th grade and below, between 5th grade and 10th grade, and then we do, you know, sort of like the teenagers and adults. We also have a lot of activities that are with kids and the parents. And those are my favorite ones because a lot of times you do workshops and you know, the parent comes to an event and he's like, you know, there's my kid, and they kind of want to step back. But what I like to do is I like to have them being involved so that we're teaching them or reminding them how to do the craft to the parents, and then they teach it to the children. But something that is very interesting is that they start telling them stories. Oh, I did this when I was a kid, or you know, my grandmother taught me this. And to hear those things is very, very important. And that's how the traditions continue. And there's also people who have no connection to Mexico who become interested in Mexico. We have, there's been people who tell us, you know, a year or two after they go to our events that they travel to Mexico, that they discover Mexico through our events, and that they are very, very happy to know that, you know, that the traditions are here, they continue, and that the community is passing them on, not just to Mexicans, but to New Yorkers in general.
That's great. And so you mentioned about flores de papel, paper flowers. Do you have any other favorite workshops that people receive?
Yeah, we do piñatas, for example. That's a very popular workshop. We make piñatas small, big, all sizes. We do the Eye of God, which is a tradition from north of Mexico. We work with a lot of different artists, and so they all have a lot of different ideas for crafts. And we also do paintings with yarn. I mean, there's so many that we've been doing.
And Juan Carlos, I've noticed that the brochures that you have or the materials that you have and you hand out, they're bilingual. They're in Spanish and English. Is there a specific reason why, and not only in Spanish or not only in English?
Well, when the organization started, the idea was to bring two publics together that don't normally meet, and that was Mexicans and New Yorkers in general, who are English speakers. And so we wanted to attract these two groups. And how do we do it? Well, the best way was to do things bilingual. But then we discovered that a lot of the children were only speaking English. The children of Mexican immigrants were mostly speaking English. And a lot of the parents would say, my kid doesn't want to speak Spanish, or my kid doesn't want to learn Spanish. We had a lot of workshops and classes, and then we realized that it's not that they don't want to, it's just that there's not an interest for many reasons. It has to do with school, it has to do with being an immigrant, the child of an immigrant. I mean, I was born in Mexico and I grew up here, so I totally understand the sort of rejection you have towards your immigrant parents. But a lot of the kids, when they learn a little bit about the history and traditions, they become interested. So we had kids that, we had a program that lasted 9 months, and some of the kids didn't speak Spanish when we started. But when we ended, a lot of them were trying to speak Spanish, which means that they have to discover the beauty of the culture so that they can fall in love with it and then start to become interested in the language.
Yeah, I think it's no secret that in order to even teach Spanish, it has to be also linked to culture, so you have to place it somewhere, and it's beautiful that you're doing this. Juan Carlos, we know, I think it's not a secret also that running a non-for-profit is challenging, especially receiving funds.
Yes.
So how do you keep it running? Is it mostly private donations? Is it city funding? Can you just share with us?
It's a combination of a lot of things. So
Mm-hmm.
we have people who volunteer their time in the administrative side.
Mm-hmm.
On the artistic side, all artists are paid a fee for their service, or some of them are hired by the organization. And we receive funding from the New York City Council on the Arts, the New York State Council on the Arts, which are two
Mm-hmm.
government agencies. And we also receive private donations, some foundations, some corporations, members of the public who just want to donate. So it's a combination of all that.
Why is it important to support organizations like yours that promote culture, specifically Mexican culture?
It's extremely important to support organizations that bring diversity to the table. We see that we have seen a lot of the kids when we're presenting. And let me give you an example. So I went it was a high school, and we were doing son jarocho, which is music from Mexico. Not a lot of Mexicans know son jarocho, but here in New York it's becoming very popular. And when we started doing the performance, a lot of the students that are of non-Mexican origin started to become very interested because some of the sounds were familiar. And so, especially people from the Caribbean and people who have African roots were very, they love the music. And what we see is that when you when you teach about cultures, different cultures to people in New York City, who are a city that is very diverse, you generate conversation, you generate tolerance, and you generate unity. There's a lot of people that become very interested and want to learn more. And in the same way, when I'm not at work, I go to other. I love flamenco, for example, and I love many other traditions from other cultures. I think having diversity is extremely important. Learning about each other, understanding each other, not just by speaking or looking at each other, but also by understanding each other's culture, is extremely important, especially in a city like New York that is so diverse.
Yeah, I think that just knowing other cultures and being exposed to different cultures, I think it also highlights the similarities that we have.
And we have a lot.
Right?
Yeah.
And have you heard anything about this when people come to your events from other cultures that say, oh, this dance is similar to mine or something?
There's a lot of, I could talk forever, but I can give you one example. During Day of the Dead, we had, there was a lady that came to the event because she was walking on the street and she smelled something and she followed the smell. So she came to the event and she said, what's going on? What's this? And I said, oh, we're celebrating Day of the Dead. And she said, but what, this is, she said, this reminds me of India. And I was like, why? And she said, it's very colorful. The marigold flowers are very, very important in India. The incense you're burning smells like incense back home. And she became very emotional. So there's a lot of people that go through that. We have that with people who are of African descent. In parts of Mexico, they do some crafts that are inspired in crafts from other countries. And when these people come to our events and see them, a lot of them, they start asking questions. And that's very important. And then we see that there's a connection between us in everything that we do.
That's great. Thank you, Juan Carlos. Let's take a short break, and when we return, Juan Carlos will share with us his personal experience as an immigrant in New York and how he became involved as a culture promoter since he was a child, really. So we'll be back shortly to the Mexican Studies Oral History Project. Welcome back to the Mexican Studies Oral History Project. Juan Carlos, can you share with us your experience as an immigrant? Where were you born? I know you mentioned before that you were born in Mexico. Can you share what state, what town?
Well, I was born in Nezahualcóyotl, in the state of Mexico, but my family is from Puebla and Michoacán, so I lived in the three entities when I was a child.
And how was your experience coming to New York? Do you remember how it was for you as a child?
So we arrived at JFK on, I believe it was January 21st in 1990. It was a very cold, very, very cold day. So when we got here, I thought, what are we doing here? Let's get out of here. And then my mom sent me to school, so I started going to school. I started 5th grade, and it was a very, it wasn't a good experience, I would say.
I bet it was a culture shock also, right?
There was a culture shock, but also it was difficult because I was in the school where I was, in the classroom I was the only Mexican. And that happened growing up a lot, that everywhere I went, I was the only Mexican. So there were a lot of problems in school. There was a lot of bullying, pushing around. And so I was an altar boy at Christ the King Church in the Bronx. And the priest there, he saw that I was having a hard time in school, and I wasn't learning English at the time. So he said, we're going to send you to Catholic school. So I went to Colonel Hayes High School here in the Bronx, and it wasn't, it was better, but it was still difficult because of the language. When I got there, I didn't speak a lot of English. So it was, the transition was very difficult. But also when I was there, I was one of 2 Mexicans. And Mexico wasn't represented in the school. So I started, as always, commotion stuff, interrupting things and making things, and making sure that Mexico was represented.
And do you know, by any chance, why did your mom or your family picked New York?
Yes, well, it's a very long story, but it has to do with the history of Mexican migration. So my mom is from Puebla, and generally people from Puebla come to New York, people from Michoacán go to California. And that's exactly what happened. My father went to California, and my mom came to New York.
Oh, and so I've heard you in other conversations that we have had in events that you consider yourself now bicultural. Can you just elaborate a little bit more about how this came? As you were saying at the beginning, it was a culture shock, right? As you came in here, and now you consider yourself bicultural. Can you just tell us a little bit about this?
Yeah, so when people ask me where I'm from, I always say that I am transnational and bicultural. And what does that mean, right? Well, it means that I am Mexican, I am 100% Mexican, and I feel I'm 100% American. I speak English, I speak Spanish, and I try to speak both equally. I feel when I'm in Mexico, I'm as Mexican as anybody, and when I'm here, I want to feel as American as anyone else. I love American culture and traditions, and I love Mexican culture and traditions. I love both. And one of the reasons why I work where I work and I do what I do is because I want people here to get a better sense of Mexican culture. And if I was in Mexico, if I would go to Mexico now, I would probably get involved in promoting American culture there. Because I feel like the United States and Mexico, both of them are my home. I went to the Navy. So I enlisted here. I'm a veteran. So I'm as Mexican as an American as it could be.
That's great. And I think that is a similar story to many Mexican Americans here in New York and all over the country. Just before we went to break, I did a little teaser that you started when you were very young to promote Mexican culture. Do you remember the first event that you planned or organized?
I think everything started when I was a very young child. So when I was very young, my family moved to Michoacán, and when I was in Michoacán, I saw the racial tension that exists between mestizo Mexicans and indigenous Mexicans. And I think that's when everything started, right? That I see that if two groups don't understand each other, there has to be a connection. And connection is understanding each other or seeing each other through culture. Here in New York, the same thing happened when I went to school. I saw there was a lot of rejection from one group to another, a lot of hostility towards Mexicans. And so when I was in school, I saw that people would make fun of me just because I was Mexican. But I never understood why until I realized that it was just that there was not representation of Mexicans. So in high school, I started, doing little projects, very insignificant things, even writing assignments that had to do with social studies. They were all about Mexico. And everything I did in certain areas where it was permitted, it was about Mexican history, Mexican culture, because I wanted us to be represented. Nowadays it's very different, or maybe not, but the idea is, I want to present who I am as a person, but also as my history and my culture, and I think everybody should do that. I love learning about other people's traditions, and I want to share mine with them.
And do you remember that first event? Was it a food festival? Was it a religious festival?
Well, since we were in Catholic school, Catholic high school, it was about Our Lady of Guadalupe, and it was an event to celebrate December 12th, just like everybody else celebrates. And what we did is we did an altar at the high school, the same way that we do it in Mexico. And we did that for several years. I don't think it continued after I left, but the idea was to present, our really part of our identity. Our Lady of Guadalupe, even if you're religious or not, it's a very important part of Mexican history. The War of Independence was fought with the banner of Our Lady of Guadalupe, so she's extremely important, and I wanted to transmit that to other people.
That's great. And you just mentioned a little while ago that you're actually a Navy veteran. Can you tell us about that experience?
Well, it was also a culture shock. I mean, when I enlisted in the Navy in 1999, and it was great. We did a lot of things. We traveled all over the world. I was part of several of the operations that happened after 9/11, Operation Enduring Freedom, Operation Iraqi Freedom, and they were difficult. I mean, being in the Navy is not easy. Being in the Armed Forces is not easy. So, but I'm very grateful that I did that. I learned a lot, and I loved it, and I miss it sometimes.
Can you share with us how can our viewers reach out to Mano Mano? Do you have any social media?
Yes, you can find us on social media as Mex Culture, and that's our name on social media. Our webpage is manomano.us. Or you can just search Mexican culture in New York, and we'll be the first one to pop up.
Juan Carlos, thank you so much for sharing with us the story of Mano Mano and also your personal story.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us for one more episode of the Mexican Studies Oral History Project with Juan Carlos Aguirre. We hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as we did, and we look forward to seeing you in the next episode of the Mexican Studies Oral History Project.